Medicine has come a long way. When we look back at the history books, you've got to wonder what some doctors were thinking. In modern times, the weight loss industry is like a $60 billion business, a large portion of which is spent on diet pills. And while the first fat-busting pills went on the market in the late 1880s, no other pills have had quite the speedy rise and fall as fen-phen did in the 1990s. Originally released in the market as two separate things, the appetite suppressant fenfluramine and the amphetamine phentermine were marketed as short-term diet aids, but proved largely ineffective on their own. In the late 1970s, however, the two products were combined by a Dr. Michael Weintraub to create what became known as fen-phen. Now, this doctor conducted a single study with 121 patients over the course of 4 years. The patients, 2/3 of which were women, lost an average of 30 pounds with seemingly no side effects. But the doctor's study didn't monitor the patients' hearts, so the new miracle substance was introduced to the market in 1992 and people couldn't get enough of it. Some doctors, looking for a quick way to make cash, operated fen-phen mills, where desperate patients looking to shed some weight would pay anything for these things. Soon, like 6 million Americans were using it. Well, fast forward, April 1996, after a crazy debate, the FDA agreed to approve this, pending a 1-year trial. And then almost immediately, a lot of reports of really bad side effects came pouring in. That July, the Mayo Clinic said that 24 women taking this had developed serious heart valve abnormalities. Hundreds of more cases were reported, and by September, the FDA had pulled this thing. By 1999, the American Home Products Corporation, the producers of it, agreed to pay a $3.75 billion settlement to those injured by taking this. More than 50,000 liability lawsuits were filed in the years following its withdrawal from the market. And patients are still able to file injury claims to this day. Walter Freeman thought he'd found a way to alleviate the pain and distress of the mentally and emotionally ill. Instead, he created one of history's most horrific medical treatments. Freeman developed his procedure, which became known as a prefrontal lobotomy, based on earlier research by a Portuguese neurologist. Early versions of Freeman's cure involved drilling holes into the top of his patients' skulls and later evolved into hammering an ice pick-like instrument through the eye sockets to sever the connections between the frontal lobe and the thalamus, which he believed to be the part of the brain that dealt with human emotion. Freeman soon teamed up with James Watt, and after practicing on cadavers, they performed their first procedure on a live patient in 1936, a woman who suffered from depression, agitation, and sleeplessness. And it was deemed a success, but it wasn't a success. Patients were left in vegetative states. They experienced relapses. They regressed physically and emotionally, and about 15% of overall patients died. One of the most infamous victims was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of future President John F. Kennedy, who was left incapacitated and spent the rest of her life needing full-time care. Well, Freeman was as much a showman as he was a doctor, traveling to 23 states to demonstrate his miracle cure. In all, he performed like 3,500 lobotomies on patients over his time, and despite the obvious risks and lack of concrete success rates, hospitals willingly let this guy continue because lobotomized patients were easy to deal with. Thankfully, everything changed in 1967 when Freeman performed a lobotomy on one of his original patients, a housewife living in California. Well, this time he nicked something bad, and the patient passed away of a brain hemorrhage, finally putting an end to Freeman's haphazard brain hacking. In the early 1900s, John Brinkley became one of the richest doctors in America, despite having no medical qualifications. This man claimed he could cure impotence, infertility, and other problems of that nature by surgically implanting goat testicles into a man's scrotum. Shocker! The surgery had no scientific merit and was extremely dangerous. A lot of people died. I wonder why. Claiming to cure tuberculosis back in 1887, William Radham used plant-based ingredients and water to create a substance that he passed off as a medicine that would kill all the microbes in your red fluid stream, and it was going to cure you of most of your diseases. He was really sure about this. In his book, because, wrote a big book, Microbes and the Microbe Killer, William made the simple statement that all diseases have a single origin. There is, in truth, but one disease. Well, drawing on a combination of personal narrative, pseudoscientific jargon, and emotional appeals, he used his book to market a product that cost virtually nothing to produce, yet yielded significant profits. So the logo for this whole thing, which decorated the cover of his most famous book, would have been very familiar to you if you read newspapers back in the late 19th century. Like, for example, in the Virginia newspaper, newspaper, Roanoke Times, the words microbe and radum appear on more than 200 pages in 2 years, so approximately once every 3 days. So in the end, this extraordinary success in marketing this product not only made this doctor rich, it made his product an early target of efforts to monitor food and substances. In April of 1910, 12 cases of this microbe killer were seized on the grounds of, false, exaggerated, and misleading labels, and the contents were rightfully destroyed. 4 years later, in 1914, following an amendment in the FDA, a shipment was seized by government agencies, and after a hearing by a jury, more than 800 cartons and boxes of this killer were destroyed. But the ads were still appearing everywhere. Turns out, after the product was analyzed, they were like, this is just water with almost undetectable levels of sulfuric acid, the stuff in batteries. No wonder it was destroyed. In the United States, chloroform began to replace ether as an anesthetic at the beginning of the 20th century. It was first prepared in 1831 by the American chemist Dr. Samuel Guthrie, who combined some substances with chlorinated lime in an attempt to produce a cheap pesticide. In 1847, the Scottish physician Sir James Young Simpson first used the sweet-smelling, colorless, non-flammable liquid as an anesthetic. When administered by dripping the liquid onto a sponge or cloth held so that the patient inhaled the vapors, it was seen to have some very fun effects on the central nervous system, and produced those effects pretty quickly. So when things were in a state of chaos, ether and chloroform were indispensable tools for military doctors. These guys performed tens of thousands of amputations and other procedures out in the field. Now eventually it was abandoned in favor of ether because we found out it was toxic. Turns out it causes fatal cardiac arrhythmias. It's known as sudden sniffer's death, so it's been replaced by safer things. In the 19th century, cigarettes were widely considered to benefit health. Tobacco advertisers often used the depiction of an ear, nose, and throat doctor to promote them. Now, people in those days didn't know about lung cancer, but they knew that things were rough on your throat, according to a Dr. Robert Jackler, founder of the research group Stanford Research into the Impact of Tobacco. So advertising, which documents the history of tobacco advertising, they knew that smoking irritates and makes you cough and gag. So having a throat doctor tell you it's okay, well, that was key to success. By today's standards, the ads were shocking. In one ad, a doctor's like, hey, you could live to 100, while promoting the virtues of smoking. The none too subtle message was that if the doctor, with all of his expertise, chose to smoke a particular brand, it must be safe. Now, unlike with celebrity and athletic endorsers, the doctors depicted were never specific individuals, because if you were a doctor that engaged in this, you would lose your license. There was one ad that depicted an actual doctor. Dr. G. Edward Roerig practiced initially in Chicago, later in LA, and he died of lung cancer. So because of all this false information, asthmatics would smoke because they were like, hey, let's get rid of asthma by smoking. And now we know it only made it worse. If you were to go under in the water in the late 18th century, your best chance of survival would be for a good Samaritan to come to your aid in a way that you wouldn't expect. So to help you, we gotta get everything wet off of you, dry you off, get everything out, warm you up. In a way, you could just go near a fire. And then somebody would light a tobacco pipe, cover the bowl with their handkerchief, insert the opposite end into your rear end, and blow. Turns out that's where blowing smoke up your that came as an expression. Tobacco smoke enemas were considered a successful treatment for cholera and were recommended as an alternative remedy to other treatments at the time. The exact procedure varied, and in some instances, a pint of boiling tobacco-infused water was administered into the intestines. It was even reported that hundreds of lives might have been spared by this whole thing. Hey, if you want to do it, go nuts. Not for me. And that's all for today, folks. I've been Alexa. See ya.